If you were to look at a map of the United States in December of 1862, tracing the jagged, bleeding lines of the front, you would see a nation on the precipice of absolute ruin. We often look back at the Civil War through the lens of inevitable Union victory, seeing the industrial might of the North as an irresistible tide that would eventually drown the Confederacy. But in the winter of 1862, that victory was not only uncertain, to many people it seemed impossible. The year had been a catastrophe for Abraham Lincoln's administration. In the East, the Army of the Potomac, the pride of the Union, had just been smashed against Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg. Thousands of blue-clad soldiers lay dead in the Virginia snow, and with them the morale of the Northern public. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant's overland campaign against Vicksburg had bogged down in the Mississippi mud, and William Tecumseh Sherman had been repulsed in a battle at Chickasaw Bayou. Politically, the ice was thinning beneath Lincoln's feet. In September, following the carnage at the Battle of Antietam, he had issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a gamble, a massive strategic pivot that transformed the war from a fight to preserve a political map into a moral crusade against human bondage. But that proclamation was set to become law on January 1st, 1863, just days away. Lincoln knew, and his cabinet knew, that if the proclamation went into effect against the backdrop of continuous military defeat, it would be seen not as a thunderbolt of justice, but as the desperate cries of a dying administration. It might even spark foreign intervention from Britain or France, who were watching the Confederacy's resilience with growing interest. And so Lincoln needed a victory. He didn't just want one, he needed one to save the political life of the nation. And his eyes turned to Middle Tennessee. It was there, 30 miles southeast of Nashville, along the winding rocky banks of Stones River, that two massive armies were coiling like vipers in the winter cold. One was the Union Army of the Cumberland, commanded by Major General William Stark Rosecrans, a brilliant, erratic, devout Catholic intellectual who could engineer a supply depot as well as he could a battle plan. The other was the Army of Tennessee, led by General Braxton Bragg, a sour, dyspeptic disciplinarian who was as much at war with his own generals as he was with the Yankees. What was about to happen between these two men and the 80,000 soldiers they commanded would result in the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War by percentage of men engaged. It would be a fight of singular ferocity, fought in freezing rain through dense cedar thickets that tore uniforms to shreds, and over jagged limestone rocks that became slick with blood. It would feature one of the most poignant moments of the war, a battle of bands in the cold night air, and one of its most tragic charges. This is the story of the Battle of Stones River. So to understand why Stones River became such a bloodbath, we have to understand the pressure cooker that both generals were living under. Let's start with the Union. Rosecrans was a fascinating figure. He's an engineer, he's an inventor, and a deeply religious man who would often stay up late into the night discussing theology with his staff. He was also, in the eyes of Washington, frustratingly slow. After taking over command from Don Carlos Buell late in 1862, Rosecrans had spent weeks in Nashville refusing to move. He was stockpiling rations, drilling his men, and securing his supply lines. When Abraham Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck badgered him into attacking, Rosecrans famously retorted, "I will not move until I am ready." He believed that marching into the Tennessee winter without adequate supplies was tantamount to murder. But by Christmas 1862, the ultimatum from Washington was crystal clear: move or be removed. Lincoln wrote to him, quote, "If there is anything in history to equal the patience of the American people, it is not within my knowledge," end quote. The subtext was clear. The Emancipation Proclamation was about to take effect. The Army had to move. On the other side of the line, in the town of Murfreesboro, sat Braxton Bragg. If Rosecrans was loved by his men, Bragg was, at best, tolerated. He was a master of logistics and discipline, but he had a toxic personality that alienated his subordinates. This is a man who, during the Mexican War, his subordinates had twice tried to kill him, his own men. His corps commanders now, in December of 1862, men like Bishop-turned-General Leonidas Polk and professional soldiers like William Hardy, well, let's just say they openly distrusted him. The Army of Tennessee was a powerful weapon, but its handle was cracked. Bragg had retreated from Kentucky after the Battle of Perryville in October, a move that enraged the Southern press. He, too, needed a victory to keep his job. Bragg had positioned his army in a defensive crescent in front of Murfreesboro. Why Murfreesboro? Because it was the breadbasket of this part of the Confederacy. The rich farms of Middle Tennessee were feeding Southern armies, and the town sat across the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and the Stones River. If the Union took Murfreesboro, they would drive a wedge into the heart of the South, allowing them to threaten Chattanooga and eventually Atlanta. The discrepancy in numbers, 43,000 or so Union and about 35,000 Confederate, was a significant one, but it wasn't overwhelming, and it wasn't unlike other battles the Confederacy faced. Bragg had the advantage of choosing the ground, and the ground he chose was a nightmare. The terrain around Murfreesboro is defined by two features: the Stones River, which winds like a snake through the landscape, and the cedar glades. These weren't majestic forests. These are dense, scrubby thickets of red cedar growing out of shallow soil. Beneath the trees, the ground was a labyrinth of limestone outcroppings, jagged rocks that stuck up like teeth, making it impossible to move artillery or maintain a coherent battle line easily. It was a terrain designed for chaos. On the day after Christmas, Rosecrans finally gave the order. The Army of the Cumberland marched out of Nashville. The weather was atrocious. A cold rain fell incessantly, turning the dirt roads into soup. Private Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee, whose memoir, Company H, is maybe the greatest soldier's account of the war, described the march of the Confederates to meet them. He said, quote, "Icicles hung from their clothing, guns and knapsacks. Many were badly frostbitten. My feet peeled off like a peeled onion on that march. The horses hitched to the artillery wagons were continually slipping and sliding," end quote. For the Union soldiers, it was a slog. They moved in 3 columns, probing for the Confederate lines. Confederate cavalry under the dashing and tireless Joe Wheeler harassed them every step of the way, stinging the Union columns and forcing them to deploy, slowing their advance to a crawl. It took 4 days for Rosecrans to cover the 30 miles to Murfreesboro. By the evening of December 30th, the two armies were face to face. The Union Army had consolidated its line northwest of Murfreesboro, facing southeast. Bragg's army was there, waiting for them. That night, December 30th, was bitterly cold. The rain had stopped, but the ground had frozen. The armies were camped so close together, in some places less than half a mile apart, that they could see the glow of each other's campfires flickering through the cedar trees. And it was then that something extraordinary happened. In the silence of the winter night, a Union military band began to play. They struck up Yankee Doodle. Across the field, a Confederate band answered with the Bonnie Blue Flag. The Union band responded with Hail Columbia. The Confederates fired back with Dixie. It was a battle of the bands, a musical duel played out by men who knew they would probably be killing each other in a matter of hours. And we have accounts from the men who were there. It reminds me so much of the Christmas truce of 1914 during World War I on the Western Front. One of the accounts that we have comes from Sam C., who was also in the 1st Tennessee. And he wrote, quote, "Just before tattoo, the military bands on each side began their evening music. The still winter night carried their strains to great distance. At every pause on our side, far away could be heard the military bands of the other. Finally, one of them struck up Home Sweet Home. As if by common consent, all other airs ceased, and the bands of both armies, as far as the ear could reach, joined in the refrain. Who knows how many hearts were bowled the next day by reason of that air," end quote. Just imagine the scene. 80,000 men shivering in the frozen mud, singing Home Sweet Home together in the dark. It's one of those moments in the Civil War that almost feels too cinematic to be true. But we have documentation from multiple eyewitnesses. It was a last moment of shared humanity before the slaughter. While the men sang, the generals planned. And in a twist of fate that military historians call the folding knife, Rosecrans and Bragg devised the exact same battle plan. Rosecrans' plan was to hold with his right wing and swing with his left wing, commanded by Thomas Crittenden, across the river to crush Bragg's right flank. Bragg's plan was to hold with his right wing and swing with his left wing, commanded by William Hardee, to crush Rosecrans' right flank. It was a race. Whoever struck first would likely win. Rosecrans' plan was for an attack at 7 a.m. on the 31st of December. Bragg ordered his to begin at dawn at 6 a.m. That 1 hour difference would determine the fate of the nation. It's dawn on December 31st, 1862, New Year's Eve. A heavy fog clung to the ground, mixing with the smoke of damp campfires. On the Union far right, the division of Brigadier General Richard Johnson was just waking up. These men were positioned near the Franklin Pike at the very end of the Union line. They were confident. They believed the Confederates were in retreat. Many of the men were cooking breakfast, coffee boiling over the fires, muskets stacked. Their horses were unhitched and being watered. They had no idea that less than 1,000 yards away, 10,000 Confederate soldiers were crouching in the pre-dawn gloom, bayonets fixed. This was McCown's division and Cleburne's division of Hardee's Corps, the hammer of Bragg's army. And at 6 o'clock, the hammer fell. The Confederates surged out of the mist with a rebel yell that one soldier said sounded like a million demons. They hit the Union right like a tidal wave. The surprise was total. A soldier from Florida remembered the chaos of that moment. He said, quote, "The nearest they came to getting me was shooting a hole in my pants. The man in front of me got slightly wounded, and the one on my right mortally, and the one on my left killed," end quote. The Union division commanded by Johnson simply evaporated. Regiments broke before they could form a line. General Edward Kirk was mortally wounded trying to rally his men. General Augustus Willich was captured when his horse was shot out from under him. In minutes, the Union right flank was simply gone, swept away as if by a broom. The collapse was catastrophic. As the Union troops fled in panic, running back through the cedars, they crashed into the next division down the line, commanded by Jefferson C. Davis. Davis's men tried to make a stand, but the Confederates were moving so fast, and the terrain was so confusing that they were flanked almost immediately. The folding knife was closing. Bragg's plan was working perfectly. He was rolling up the Union line from right to left, pushing them back against the Stones River to cut off their retreat to Nashville. By 8 a.m., the situation was desperate. thousands of Union soldiers were streaming to the rear. The roads were clogged with panicked men, riderless horses, and broken wagons. It looked like a rout. It looked like the end of the Army of the Cumberland. But in the center of the Union right wing, there was a young division commander who had risen before dawn. His name was Phil Sheridan, and he was ready. Phil Sheridan was a scrapper. Small, aggressive, and profane, he would go on to become one of the most famous generals of the war. But on the morning of December 31st, 1862, he was just another division commander trying to keep his army from being annihilated. Unlike the commanders to his right, Sheridan had sensed that something wasn't right. He had his men up at 4 a.m. in line of battle, eating breakfast with their weapons in hand. When the gray tide rolled over Davis's division and slammed into Sheridan's front, they didn't find a sleeping camp. They found a wall of fire. Sheridan's division was positioned in a dense cedar forest filled with those jagged limestone rocks. As the Confederates attacked, divisions led by Cheatham and Claiborne, the fighting dissolved into a savage, close-quarters brawl. The lines were sometimes only yards apart, separated by the thick scrub. This was an area that would go down in history as the slaughter pen. The casualties here were horrific. Sheridan's 3 brigade commanders were all hit. Brigadier General Joshua Sill, a classmate of Sheridan's at West Point and a brilliant young officer, was shot dead early in the fight. Colonel George Roberts was killed. Colonel Frederick Schaefer was killed. Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee, fighting on the Confederate side, walked through this area later, and he wrote, quote, "I cannot remember now of ever seeing more dead men and horses and captured cannon all jumbled together than the scene of blood and carnage. The ground was literally covered with blue coats, dead," end quote. Sheridan's men held on defiantly. They repulsed 3 massive Confederate assaults, but they were running out of ammunition. The supply wagons had been cut off by the Confederate cavalry or lost in the chaos of the retreat. Men began scavenging cartridges from the dead wherever they could. Sheridan realized he was being flanked on both sides. The divisions to his right were gone. The division to his left, Negley's, fighting defiantly, was buckling. If he stayed, he would be encircled. If he ran, the army would die. He executed a fighting retreat. Backing up slowly through the cedars, his men fired their last rounds and then fixed bayonets. They bought Rosecrans precious time. Time to realize the disaster that was unfolding and time to form a new line. By 11 a.m., Sheridan's division emerged from the cedars, bloodied, exhausted, and out of ammunition, but they had not routed. They had absorbed the momentum of the Confederate attack. While Sheridan was fighting for his life in the cedars, General Rosecrans was riding frantically across the battlefield. He had abandoned his headquarters. He was everywhere at once, rallying his troops, placing batteries, and trying to forge a new line out of the chaos. He was a striking figure, but the scene around him was gruesome. At one point during the battle, his chief of staff and close friend, Colonel Julius Garrichet, was riding beside him. A Confederate cannonball screamed through the air and decapitated Garrichet, splashing his blood and brains over Rosecrans' uniform as his horse continued riding with his headless body. Rosecrans didn't stop. He wiped his face and kept riding, shouting to his men, "We shall conquer or die right here." The Union line had now been bent back like a jackknife. The blade was almost closed. The only thing that was keeping it from snapping shut was the hinge. That hinge was a position known as the Round Forest. Located along the Nashville Pike and the railroad, the Round Forest was a small 4-acre grove of trees on a slight rise. It commanded the battlefield. If the Confederates took it, they would control the pike, the Union Army's lifeline. Holding this position was the brigade of Colonel William B. Hazen. Hazen was a strict disciplinarian. He wasn't well liked by his troops before the battle, but he was respected by them forever afterward. His brigade was composed of the 9th Indiana, the 6th Kentucky, the 41st Ohio, and the 110th Illinois. And it was the only Union unit that had not retreated an inch all day. Bragg knew the importance of the Round Forest. He ordered General Leonidas Polk to take it. What followed was a series of disjointed, piecemeal attacks that wasted the flower of the Confederate Army. First came Brigadier General James Chalmers' Mississippians. They had to advance across an open cotton field to reach the Round Forest. As they stepped out, Hazen's men and the massed Union artillery tore them to shreds. The attack was broken by the fences of the Cowan farm and the sheet of lead coming from the woods. Chalmers was wounded, and his brigade was shattered. Next came General Daniel Donelson's brigade. They charged into the same meat grinder. Then Jackson's brigade. Then Adams' brigade. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry smashed against Hazen's line. The cotton field in front of the Round Forest became carpeted with gray and butternut bodies. The soldiers called it Hell's Half Acre. A soldier from the 32nd Alabama described the futility, quote, "We charged in 50 yards of them, and had not the timely order of retreat been given, none of us would now be alive to tell the tale. Our regiment carries 280 into action and came out with 58. Inside the Round Forest, Hazen's men were running low on ammunition, just like Sheridan's had. But unlike Sheridan, Hazen was on the pike. He could get resupplied. He stripped the ammunition from the dead and wounded and kept on firing. By 4 p.m., Bragg was desperate. He ordered his last fresh reserves, 2 brigades from John C. Breckinridge's division, to cross the river and attack the Round Forest. But even these fresh troops could not break the hinge of Rosecrans' line. Hazen held. As the sun set on New Year's Eve, the firing finally died down. The Union Army had given up 3 miles of ground. They had lost thousands of men. They were cold, wet, and hungry, but they had not broken. The night of December 31st was a horror show. The temperature dropped below freezing. A cold rain began to fall again. In the fields between the armies, thousands of wounded men lay freezing to death. Their cries, "Water! Water! Help me!" filled the air, a mournful chorus that kept the survivors awake. At Union headquarters, a small log cabin near the pike, Rosecrans gathered his generals. They were exhausted. McCook, whose wing had been crushed, advised retreating to Nashville. He argued that the army was in a trap with the river at its back. Rosecrans listened. He looked at his map. He looked at his generals. Then he rode out to the rear to check the situation for himself. He saw torches flickering in the distance. At first he feared it was Confederate cavalry cutting off his retreat. But then he realized it was his own cavalry, lighting fires to warm themselves. The road to Nashville was still open. He rode back to the cabin and made his decision. He would not retreat. He turned to his generals and said, "Gentlemen, we fight or die right here." On the Confederate side, Braxton Bragg was writing a telegram to Richmond. "God has granted us a happy new year," he wrote. He was convinced that he had won a great victory. He assumed Rosecrans would be gone by morning. He was wrong. When the sun rose on January 1st, 1863, the day the Emancipation Proclamation became law, Bragg looked through his field glasses and saw the Union Army was still there. They had dug in. They were ready for round 2. Now, January 1st was a strange day. There was little fighting. Both armies were too exhausted. They spent the day reorganizing, tending to the wounded, and staring at each other across the mud. Rosecrans used the time to shift his lines. He moved the division of Horatio Van Cleve, which was commanded by Colonel Samuel Beatty, across the Stones River to the east bank. Now, this was a crucial move. There was a hill on the east bank that commanded the lower ford of the river. If the Union could hold that hill, they could place artillery there and enfilade Bragg's entire line. If the Confederates held it, they could shell the Union rear. Bragg realized this, but too late. By the morning of January 2nd, he knew he had to take that hill. This brings us to the final tragic act of the battle. On the morning of January 2nd, Bragg summoned John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge was a former vice president of the United States, a Kentucky politician turned general. He commanded the best division in Bragg's army, including the famous Orphan Brigade, Kentuckians who could not return home because their state had stayed in the Union. Bragg ordered Breckinridge to take his division, about 4,500 men, and assault the Union position on the hill east of the river at 4 p.m. Now, Breckinridge was appalled by this. He had scouted the ground. He saw what Bragg didn't see or simply refused to see. Yeah, he could take the hill, but on the other side of the river, on the west bank, the Union artillery had a clear line of fire. If Breckinridge's men took the hill, they would be standing on a target range, exposed to fire from dozens of Union cannons directly into their flank. Breckinridge argued with Bragg. He drew a diagram in the dirt with a stick, showing why the attack was suicide. But Bragg was unmoved. Reportedly, he told Breckinridge, "Sir, my information is different. I have given the order to attack the enemy in your front, and I expect it to be obeyed." Breckinridge rode back to his troops in a rage. He passed General William Preston, one of his brigade commanders, and said, "Preston, this attack is made against my judgment and by the special order of General Bragg. If it should result in disaster and I be among the slain, I want you to do justice to my memory." At 4 p.m., a single signal gun fired. Breckinridge's division stepped off. It was a magnificent sight. 4,500 men in perfect battle lines, flags snapping in the wind, marching toward the hill. The Union troops on the hill, Beatty's division, were outnumbered. They fought briefly, but the Confederate wave was too strong. The Confederates swept up the slope, firing volleys, and drove the Union troops off the crest. They captured the hill. They captured the guns. Victory seemed within their grasp. Flushed with success, the Confederates didn't stop. They chased the retreating Union soldiers down the other side of the hill, toward the river, toward McFadden's Ford. They were yelling. Their blood was up. They thought they had broken the Union left, but they were walking into a trap. Waiting on the other side of the river was Captain John Mendenhall, Rosecrans' chief of artillery. While the infantry fight was raging, Mendenhall had been busy. He had assembled every available cannon he could find. He lined them up hub to hub on the ridge overlooking the ford. 12 guns here, 20 guns there. In all, he massed 58 cannons in a tight arc, all pointed at the slope the Confederates were now running down. As the gray lines reached the river, Mendenhall gave the signal. The result was physics, not war. 58 cannons opened fire almost simultaneously. A Union soldier described it as a sheet of flame that burst from the ridge. The air was filled with canister, tin cans, packed with iron balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns, as well as exploding shells. The effect was instantaneous and vaporizing. The Confederate line didn't just break, it vanished. Men were blown apart. Trees were sheared off. The ground trembled as if a volcano were discharging. In less than 45 minutes, Breckinridge lost nearly 40% of his attacking force. The survivors, stunned and shattered, scrambled back up the hill and fled into the woods. The Orphan Brigade had been massacred, just as Breckinridge had predicted. As the smoke cleared, Union General James Negley ordered a counterattack. His troops splashed across the river and retook the hill, capturing the Confederate artillery and the wounded. The Battle of Stones River was over. On the 3rd of January, the rain returned. The armies faced each other again, but the fight had gone out of Bragg at that point. His army was exhausted, demoralized by the slaughter of the orphans, and he believed, wrongly as it turned out, that Rosecrans was receiving massive reinforcements. That night, amidst a torrential downpour, the Army of Tennessee began to retreat. They marched south to Tullahoma, leaving the field, the town of Murfreesboro, and thousands of their dead and wounded to the Union. When Rosecrans rode into Murfreesboro on January 4th, he had won the battle, but the cost was staggering. On the Union side, they went into the battle with about 43,000 men. 1,700 were killed, 7,500 wounded, and nearly 5,000 were missing. About 14,000 casualties, which was about 32% of the Army. On the Confederate side of their 35,000 men, they had lost around 1,300 killed, about 8,000 wounded, and around 2,500 missing, for about 12,000 casualties. Again, about 1/3 of the Army. Think about that. 1 in every 3 men who marched into battle at Stones River was killed, wounded, or captured. It was a higher percentage of loss than Shiloh, higher than Antietam, higher even than Gettysburg. But why does Stones River matter? It wasn't the biggest battle. It didn't result in the destruction of an army. It matters because of when it happened. It happened when the North was on the brink of despair. It happened just weeks after the destructive Union defeat at Fredericksburg. It happened days before the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. If Rosecrans had lost, if Sheridan hadn't held the slaughter pen, if Hazen hadn't held the Round Forest, if Mendenhall hadn't unleashed his cannons, the Lincoln presidency might have collapsed. The proclamation might have been a dead letter. Months later, Abraham Lincoln wrote to General Rosecrans. He said, quote, "You gave us a hard-earned victory which, had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over," end quote. The battle also broke the Confederate high command in the West. Bragg never recovered the trust of his generals or his soldiers. The Army of Tennessee would fight bravely for 2 more years, but the rot that started at Stones River, the infighting, the lack of faith in leadership, would eventually consume it. Today, if you visit the battlefield, and I had the chance to visit the battlefield just a few months ago, I shot some videos there that I'm now uploading to my YouTube channel, Stories of the Civil War. If you visit it, you can still see the slaughter pen. You can walk through the Round Forest. And you can visit the Hazen Brigade Monument. It was built by Hazen's men in 1863, right after the battle. It's the oldest intact Civil War monument on a battlefield anywhere in the country. It stands as this rough-hewn limestone testament to the men who stood at the hinge and refused to break. And if you listen closely on a quiet winter night, you might just hear the faint echo of a brass band playing Home Sweet Home. This has been Stories of the Civil War. Thank you for listening.